The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
All right. So, for our final panel today, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Gail Rivard Piche from the Defense Research and Development Canada, who will lead through the defense capabilities in North America and the Arctic. So, Gail, do you need a moment? Okay. We will take a moment. Thank you again for being so sticking to time. I know I've been threatening to herd all the cats all day. So far pretty smooth, and so just be mindful of some of the time hacks so that way we don't bleed over into the next sessions again tomorrow. So thanks. So please, I actually am on the end,
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back on stage, this time as chair. So I have the pleasure of chairing this panel that is looking at NORAD and the modernization of North American defense capabilities. We have four fantastic panelists. I will ask each of them to talk for approximately 12 minutes so that we have enough time for the Q&As after the fact. And I would ask, first of all, Dr. Andrea Charron to start. As everybody knows, Director of the Center for Defense and Security Policy. She's Associated Professor of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, and she's a co-author of a new book on NORAD in perpetuity and beyond.
Thanks very much, and thank you to the organizers. So following on from what Brigadier General O'Malley said, I'm going to focus my comments on this binational command that we call NORAD, and especially this idea of NORAD modernization, which especially in Canada seems to be synonymous with only upgrading the North Warning System. But really it is a fundamental rethink of continental defense writ large. Traditionally, the defense of North America has been via NORAD, and the surveillance of the air, and later the maritime approaches to North America, but mostly between what we call 10 and 2, which already poses some problems. As a reminder, it wasn't until 2002 that we had a U.S. combatant command that was purposely dedicated to North America. Before that, it really was NORAD, it was the Joint Forces Command, and then individual services that certainly worked bilaterally to assist with the defense of North America. The conventional threats that NORAD can address are the aerospace and air threats, and also now provide a maritime warning function. When we think of the non-traditional threats, and by that I take sort of the human security concerns, which I argue are the more pressing and will aid in everything else if we deal with the lack of housing, the poor infrastructure, the fact that there's a lack of services, really isn't within the NORAD mandate. However, with NORAD modernization and a rethink of dual use capabilities, it certainly could be. As noted in the newly released U.S. Arctic strategy, conventional and unconventional threats are starting to combine, and what it means is we really need to think about how we're going to adapt to it as well. I think, however, as much as NORAD is evolving and thinking about how it can prepare for the future, I think we have built in sort of four boundaries that are in some ways artificially and arbitrarily imposed that serve as a brake for Canada and the US to really optimize, given the current mandate of how to protect North America. And those four boundaries are first those between allies and the NORAD regions themselves. The second is about information sharing, especially with local populations. The third is the limitation to NORAD's global area of operations. And finally, I think the particular focus on the Arctic, and especially that 10 and 2, leaves us vulnerable and is another barrier. So while these barriers or boundaries to thinking might have seemed like logical ideas, when we have a low strategic competition, we now have this persistent proximate threat in Russia and the pacing threat in China, which means that tensions are much higher. And it's the fact that we're an accident, an incident, or a misunderstanding away from escalating things quickly. We are now in the age of deterrence by detection and denial. And thankfully, we're getting away from deterrence by punishment. But when we're dependent on deterrence by denial, which seeks to increase the costs to adversaries, we can't afford any loopholes. And by constraining ourselves with these sort of artificial boundaries, I think they can take advantage of us. So the first is between the allies and even within the NORAD regions. And I mentioned it before, because of the U.S. Unified Combatant Command Plan, the world is divided into combatant commands. We're not allowed to call them geographic anymore, but they are there, as well as functional combatant commands. What this means is that the alliances also associated with the combatant commands, think NATO and NORAD, are also then sort of artificially constrained. And so EUCOM pays attention to the European Arctic and the Russian Arctic, and US NORTHCOM is in charge of sort of the North American Arctic, except for, as I mentioned, we have this seam problem in the Arctic. NATO's Joint Force Command in Norfolk and the U.S. Second Fleet is the start of trying to bring the NORAD US NORTHCOM world and the NATO world together. But we need far more of that. We also note that we are now seeing mentions of NORAD in NATO documents, which is unheard of, especially the NATO Arctic Foresight document. But we're still not seeing that same connection from a NORAD and a US NORTHCOM perspective. So I'm hoping that's going to change in the future, because after all, with allies and the advantages of having more access to information, in theory, we should be using that against us. The other thing that we don't do from an ally perspective is coordinate our Arctic exercises. We don't think about the different skills and capabilities that are being trained in the different contexts. And we're certainly not communicating strategically the message of these combined Arctic exercises to other adversaries. So take, for example, we had Arctic Edge, Operation Nanook, and Cold Response all within a couple of weeks of each other. And there didn't seem to be that sort of strategic messaging to say that while they may be exercising different capabilities with the US, Canada, and NATO, they are always linked. Within NORAD, I think the three NORAD regions are sort of artificially separated from each other. There's continental NORAD region, the Canadian NORAD region, and the Alaskan NORAD region, but they tend to execute their missions sort of within their regions. And while there are agreements so that we can have, for example, interceptors sort of cross boundaries, we really don't take advantage of the fact that this is a binational command, and therefore those boundaries really actually don't mean anything. We've made this agreement that we jointly defend North America. And especially as CANAR, which is all of Canada, and remember, our Arctic is 40% of our land mass and is the reason we have the longest coastline in the world, certainly greater integration and working with ANR, for example, in the Western Arctic would be a huge advantage given the distance and positioning. To the next boundary, sharing information with Arctic communities and with allies. It's been mentioned before that because we do have these allies, we maybe need to think about what constitutes North America. And certainly in a NORAD context, we can't operate in the Arctic without Greenland And so maybe Greenland and Mexico, perhaps even Iceland in the future, should be considered part of this new North American Defense Command. When it comes to our locals living in the Arctic, we tend to keep them out of the loop, and yet they have vital information that would be of incredible support and help to things like our common operating pictures. And likewise, the information that often the federal agencies collect would be essential information to share with local communities. So for example, the Marine Security Operations Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which if you don't know what the MSOCs are, especially you students, it is a fabulous thesis waiting for you. But the one in Halifax creates Canada's Arctic Maritime Operating Picture. And it's the most wonderful example of whole of government departments working together. So you have Transportation Canada, RCMP, Coast Guard, the D&D, Fisheries and Oceans, all working together, sharing the information to say, we have a common understanding of what's happening in the Arctic. We don't share that with the local communities. And therefore, the first time they find out there's a cruise ship is, it's, right off our shore. They also have valuable information that would assist and help with our common operating picture. So while NORAD is at the end of the food chain and benefits from having all of this allied and federal input, we're forgetting a key reason why we need intelligence, and that's to protect Canadians and Americans who are living in situ. The third boundary is an artificial constraint on NORAD's warning mission, which is global in scope. It can warn of anything happening anywhere so long as it's air and maritime. Except for because it's constrained within these combatant commands, it tends to restrain itself to, in a warning capacity, to their areas of responsibility. We can break out of this, and NORAD can be that seam eraser, especially in an Arctic context. When you think, for example, of the activity we're seeing in the Aleutian Islands, which is right on the border of Indo-PACOM and US Northcom, and the fact that the U.S. Coast Guard District 17 is unbelievably busy these days. Having access to the maritime and air warning information that NORAD has would be a distinct advantage. But of course, NORAD is constrained in only 1.5 domains. Really, we need to think about having a North American Defense Command that can do more. Finally, I think the last boundary of concern is the attention to the Arctic, and almost exclusively in that 10 and 2 approach, because we are talking about Arctic and North America. And that leaves our coasts vulnerable, that leaves the southern approaches vulnerable. And the other area we don't pay enough attention to is connections to Antarctica. Antarctica may actually hold a lot of lessons for how we're going to move forward in an Arctic context. First of all, the science that they do there. Let's not forget that we learned about the hole in the ozone from British scientists in Antarctica. But also, they have this mix of consultative and non-consultative state decision makers, not unlike in the Arctic Council context where you have Arctic states and observer states. And so we want to make sure that we learn from them, but also never forget that we do have our Indigenous participants that are so crucial to why the Arctic Council is unique and works so well, and that we have to make sure going forward, states don't go forward without their permanent participants. So in conclusion, Russia is, I think, forcing all of us to get dangerously close to armed conflict because we're moving along that competition scale, and it really is these accidents and incidents that could get us into trouble. I don't, however, see a straight line from aggression by Russia in Ukraine into the Arctic. And I think we have to make sure that we don't make those precipitous decisions. The shift and dependence now on deterrence by detection and denial rather than punishment, I think absolutely has to be lauded. But we are continuing to constrain ourselves with these boundaries when it comes to NORAD. The good news is, I think that these boundary problems are actually shifting of personnel and mindset, and therefore not necessarily expensive. And by fixing them, I think we will have a much better command and control architecture that then sets us up for success for the planned radar and other surveillance systems that are coming down the pipe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And we'll with Jake, Captain Navy Jacob French, who is the Deputy Commander of the Joint Task Force North, which is one of the 5, if I remember correctly, regional command under the Canadian Joint Operation Command.
Okay, I picked a good day to not have slides. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers. Thanks, Gail, for the introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here and really start the conversation. And as this panel on defense in North America, I wanted to hopefully contribute that as to what we do at Joint Task Force North. So Joint Task Force North is out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, works under CJOC. And one of the things in the command is, as we work through all 3 territories in our area of operations, in the Northern Territories and the surrounding landscape, is really understand through our operations, through our partnerships, through our engagements, is to read that social, political terrain that we see, the human interaction, really understand what changes are coming. We work through the security concerns that are either conventional, not conventional, and I think it's just fantastic work, having been there for 2 years and seeing how we do and what we do. I think it's a fantastic contribution to what we do up in the north at large. So these are really important questions, and I think some of the questions that we've already heard and that we've already discussed are extremely germane in terms of what types of threats are the most pressing, and are the conventional threats the most pressing threats, or are we seeing non-conventional threats that are more of a concern? Which of those concerns are most concerns to Northerners? Which, from a Northern security standpoint, are we going to have to be more prepared to face? Also, in our line of thinking, which ones are going to be most pertinent? Which ones are going to be the ones that we're going to need to practice the most often? I think we saw a shift since February and February 24th and the invasion of Ukraine. We saw a shift definitely in the perception of Northerners, as I was mentioned, in reading that landscape. And it was not a little story, as we had, the same day that the general was briefing Parliament and Senate Committee on National Defense on the specific threats to the Arctic and threats that needed to be briefed to government, and got called in to do that. We had a lieutenant colonel who was on the street next to one of the warm-up shelters that we had, and a guy said, "Hey," to the guy in uniform, "Hey, what are you guys doing about the Russians?" And I thought it was very interesting that we'd had that simultaneous somebody from the street asking us the same question as perhaps a senator briefing us, in virtual, probably not in the same exact phrasing and not the exact same words, but very much the same meaning. And I take 2 things. I tell that story for 2 reasons. One, I think no matter what your demographic is, you see somebody in uniform in the north, and you want to see the answer, from that person. And I think it's appropriate that they address the person in uniform and see what the answer is. And secondly, I think that perception shift of, hey, what's happening to our Arctic doesn't necessarily matter to just the politicians that are in Ottawa and just the politicians from the Northwest Territories, but also to the folks on the street who are wondering, hey, what are you doing here? Why are you doing what you're doing? What are you guys doing about the Russians? So I thought that was a very telling story. So in terms of thinking about the threats, I think this is going to require, as mentioned by General O'Malley and also by some others here, it's going to require a balance. I think the Whitney Lackenbauer model of how we deal with, or how we address the threats, so how we identify them, is particularly germane, as we see that through the Arctic threats, conventional threats, whether it be hypersonic or cruise missiles, kinetic threats that will go through the Arctic, not necessarily the same as threats that are going to be played out to the Arctic, or threats to the Arctic, or threats that are going to develop in the Arctic. Very key to the discussion. I think we also, and looking at threats, need to consider, the conventional versus non-conventional, and as some folks have already addressed that. What are we actually differentiating here? And are more conventional threats are more concern, or unconventional threats are more concern? One of the key things I think to take away from that is there really much point in dwelling on the difference or which bucket they fall under? Can they be considered much, in the same, put in the same bucket, and the threat is a threat? We'll call out for what exactly it is. Do we deal with them any differently? Are our capabilities the same that we have to detect, deter, deny? And if our capabilities are much the same, then maybe we should really be focusing on that, and not necessarily whether they fall into the conventional or unconventional. So just some things to think about as we get started. I'd just like to focus with that in mind on three main things that are kind of a lens or an approach to the problems that I see, and hopefully then leaves a little bit more time for questions, and perhaps can delve in a little bit more into certain examples. But the first is working on our recognition of what's a threat, and working on the recognition of the threats that are going to be the most pertinent, as I mentioned. And how are we ascertaining what is a threat? And I think in building the necessary capabilities for credible deterrence, we'll need to consider the tools for supplementing the conventional with these unconventional threats, quote unquote, and make sure those capability sets are matched to have the flexibility to do just that. A lot of that's already been mentioned in the previous presenters. But a capability that integrate those range of sensors for pan-domain, that range of sensors from either maritime to cyber, and not necessarily focusing on exactly the domain, but working on the problem set of what range of sensors is going to be the best for that particular threat. When we're dealing with these types of capabilities, or when we're trying to roadmap the capabilities, we're really looking at dealing with below threshold quite a bit. What is going to be the below threshold activities that we're going to need to worry about, the illicit activities that we're going to need to worry about, and that really needs to be a key focus as we look at the capabilities that are going to be required. Foreign actor influence, not necessarily foreign actor invasion, but how is foreign actor influence in the Arctic going to play out for Canada, for America, for North American defense? So that really, puts the onus on us for that combined and joint effort, and not just presence, and not just putting out the military into the zone and hoping for the best, but that continual work on analysis and understanding of what threats are we working against as we're doing that, recognition of those threats occurring, and being prepared to do that. It's already been mentioned, a lot about the intelligence sharing at the local level, and I really see that in Joint Task Force North, and we really see that through our talking to the communities, our talking to the Indigenous governments. I see it especially through our use of the Canadian Rangers that are in 65 of the 72 communities in the North, that are a fantastic link to that community for what's going on in that community, that are a fantastic representation of what the Canadian forces are doing in the North at large. And the fact that they're not a weaponized force or a combat set of troops is really relevant in my mind, because what they do for that sharing back and forth and what they represent, the information they can give us, and the information their communities give us throughout the North is absolutely fantastic. So it's up to us to work on that recognition. Secondly, I think we need to identify where we are weak. And I think that part is us looking in the mirror and having a mirror and shining it on the exact spots that we don't necessarily want to look at. We need to maintain and renew the type of operational dialogue with allies to illuminate the gaps, the vulnerabilities, and I'd say the chinks in our armor to adequately equipped. When we talk to our close allies at AUCOM, and which we just visited last week, we talked to our close allies over in Nuuk in Greenland and Joint Arctic Command. The conversations are a lot the same as they were obviously before the invasion of the Ukraine, but still probably even more germane now. But we're looking at ways that we adequately get equipped, and we got to identify the weak spots that we have in betweens, where they are geographically, where they are in the domains that we don't necessarily practice in. And in all that, we really want to make sure that our efforts with these allies are very coordinated, very orchestrated, but we need to apply some honesty and transparency into what we're not doing so well, and to share that with allies where we might need their help, and to even look at the problem set from AUCOM's point of view as to how it's going all the way across to ours, and where do they have perhaps gaps, seams, chinks in their armor that they want to see Canada play out, what JTF-N role can play there, information sharing, intelligence sharing, you name it, or even just exercising in a new domain that we're maybe not comfortable with. So I find this this analysis is very helpful for how we're going to look ahead. Also, in applying the lessons identified, and part of this theme I really think is the role of data and the role of analysts, the role of scientists within our organizations and for academics as well to be implanted in the right spots. So we are honestly learning the lessons, and we're not just generating a false optimism on how we did. And third is, and this is really my job description, is to practice where we're weak. So if we identified that, we've identified the threats, and then we need to practice in those areas that we have, we need to really enhance. And I think that we need to enhance and understand our contribution to domains that we haven't overly practiced in. And it was already mentioned about, do we need to really focus on which domain it is? Do we need to focus on if it's conventional or unconventional? The fact is, if we recognize the threat is going to be there, the threat is likely going to come from an area that we haven't seen it before, it's a non-traditional avenue perhaps, then this is where we actually really need to practice. Part of the job of the Arctic Security Working Group, which meets twice a year, that we host and co-chair with the territorial governments, is to look at the Arctic Security Working Groups looks at those problem sets and those areas that are not going to be commonly practiced in. How does it apply then to an Arctic security standpoint? I think this next month in November we'll be looking specifically at things that are changing in the cyber domain for the North, things that are changing in the space domain, and in the information domain. And we're going to focus on those areas, working with whole of government partners, partners from across agencies across government, as well as industry, as well as Indigenous governments, to talk about those things as the way they see them and frame that problem. I think Nanook, Operation Nanook, which operates throughout the year in 4 different cycles, is as well a good stressing function of practicing in along where we see that we're not practicing so much, and we need to be stressing that. So it's not necessarily about generating a large-scale exercise in areas of the North where it's hard to do that, but it's also putting discrete elements. Nanook is about putting a discrete element here, a discrete element here, a force package that can sustain itself for this long here, working with allies, working with partners in order to bring them into Nanook as well. And that's a real stressing function, and I think we need to work on that. Part of the thing about Nanook is if I'm not stressing my logisticians, or if my logisticians aren't a little bit stressed about how we're planning a Nanook, then I'm probably not doing my job. It's stressful to try to figure out plan logistics in the North, and that becomes in and of itself something that we need to keep on practicing because it's not comfortable. It's actually not something that we're great at. And that ties into with how we're exercising with our allies in a joint sense in the Arctic, the frequency that we're doing that, and not just in Operation Nanook. So that last point of practicing where we're weak is that military presence and putting ourselves up there and working through those non-comfort zones, not necessarily about the presence alone, but what is the effect that we're trying to achieve? Are we showing our willingness and ability to reply to a number of different scenarios and not just the scenarios that we're used to? So just in summary, I think where do we need to go next? And I think that's part of it is about setting the conditions through partnerships and engagement for capabilities, best practices that keep us flexible, that keep us agile, and that create credible deterrence. Part of that is recognition, and then secondly is to identify it and practice it. Getting out of those comfort zones every once in a while, deal with the unconventional, and to make sure that our forces are multi-role, that they can be used to, whether it be through emergency management, better support of law enforcement, better support of anything that would deal with climate change. Those are the types of the multi-role things that would play through in an operation in a sense that give us that right amount of flexibility and agility and prepare us for those unforeseen circumstances in the future. So pushing ourselves into thinking perhaps a little bit unconventionally and not just conventionally about the problem. So to circle right back to the conversation that we have on the street, which is much the same logic that we have to apply to the politicians in Ottawa. What are we doing about the Russians? Well, it's easy to dismiss that question and say not necessarily much has changed. A land invasion in Ukraine is not exactly the same as what's going to play on the Arctic, but I think it also behooves us to say, let's look at that question a little bit more closely and let's not dismiss the gist of that question, because we need to really portray, I think at all times throughout the North, why we're doing what we're doing, the logic of what we're doing, and in practicing it, really display to a multiple of people, the public and to the government, what we're doing to address the situation. So thanks for that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Unless Dr. Corriveau is back, I will ask Colonel Clark to come forward. Colonel Clark is currently serving on a faculty at the U.S. Army War College. In his previous assignment on the Armed Staff, he was responsible for the development of the U.S. Army Arctic strategy and a subsequent war game to further refine those ideas. And those experiences is what he will be basing his presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Piche. I wish I had been smart enough to have done some sabotage so that I wouldn't have to be the last speaker of the day. So that worked out very nicely for me. Thanks to all the sponsors, and thanks to all of you for making this such a rich conversation. As Dr. Piche mentioned, though this is based off of some work that I've done in my official capacity. Of course, as we've heard again and again today, these are my own observations. And so leading into that, just two elements to give some context about where I'm coming from so you can understand the nature of my remarks. The first is that the U.S. Army Arctic strategy was based off of a recognized gap in our capability, the U.S. Army's environmental competence to operate within the Arctic region. That originally came out of then Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, had already identified that early in 2020, but really the catalyst for this was our Chief of Staff, General James McConville, did a trip to the Pacific in July 2020, which happened to be my first month and my second tour in the Pentagon, and then based off of the discussions that he had with the Commanding General of U.S. Army Alaska, he said that we really needed to get after it. So this was a desire to build U.S. Army capabilities that we felt we had lost over 20 years. The second aspect of this is kind of complementary to that, in that Headquarters Department of the Army does not set regional policy. Within our system, as many of you will know, that's something that is reserved to the Office of Secretary of Defense. So we were confined very narrowly to what do we need to do in order to generate forces that are capable to operate in these regions, not necessarily determining where, when, and how they would be used, even though we were going to be informed by that with all the work that was being done at the Office of Secretary of Defense. So my comments are built off of what that focus on how do we build the capability, not necessarily what it would be used for. So what did we learn? So I apologize that for most of the people in this room, the next two slides will be filled with nothing but obvious statements of fact that you are well aware of from your experiences. Yet, nonetheless, I think that even though it deserves to be said, because it's amazing how many people, much like me, were not necessarily Arctic experts, but were put into it and were cast into the role despite having very little expertise. But also I think that collectively these truisms, while they appear fairly obvious, actually have some important implications that hopefully will even get this esteemed audience thinking. I'll admit that actually I began as a bit of a skeptic in terms of the Arctic capability on this first point, but then it really comes into it became something that I believed in very strongly, in that in most of your domains, most of your environments within the world, well-disciplined, well-trained, well-equipped forces are going to be able to eventually succeed. Now, they might not necessarily be very effective or efficient at first, but over time you can put those forces in, and they're going to be able to succeed, before too long, and be able to overcome. Within the Arctic, and certainly within the extreme cold weather aspect of the Arctic, that simply just is not true. And so one of the elements we had as we were doing our war gaming that I think a lot of our combat resolution tables and all of the figuring out what different forces are able to do versus each other, I'm not sure that we actually have, most of which were based off of World War II experiences. I'm not sure that we even necessarily know how to model and simulate the tactical aspect of forces, much less how to build them always. Dr. Greaves had put forward something that we kind of came to as well, in terms of that there's not a single Arctic. Just as some of this was for geopolitical reasons, he had his three regions, But I think they do fairly well as in terms of their tactical environments, in terms of both the topography and then also the infrastructure that is available. So there's not a single Arctic. Now within the strategy, we said that we're actually building forces for the Arctic, subarctic, high altitude, and mountainous regions, and that the forces would be equally capable in all of those. I actually came to the conclusion, I don't think that that actually is a thing. I don't think that that is possible for one set of forces to be able to do that. However, one thing that I think we need to do more research on, at least within the U.S. Army, is figuring out where exactly those the bounds of competence for forces who are capable in one of those regions is able to extend to the other. And also, I would say that the Arctic is a full year problem. And so it's not simply, can I fight and survive first, and then can I fight effectively within the extreme cold weather environment, but in some cases the thaw, in some cases the summer is just as challenging or even more so in some aspects. So all of this goes to the element that, and this is our Chief General McConville's words, when these forces, when we have to decide that we want to build tactical forces, they have to go cold and they have to stay cold. In other words, that they will be dedicated forces to the Arctic mission. And then with these caveats at the end, I think that it's actually probably even more specific than that. And so it might be to the North American Arctic, might be actually what we're building forces for, as opposed to forces that could be used anywhere within the region. But tactical units do not add up to operational capability. So even when we talk about these, if I want to build, and so for those of you who are not aware, we have 2 infantry brigade combat teams that are in Alaska, and so those are kind of our building blocks. But simply having competent tactical forces is not enough. And so there's some additional operational aspects in order to realize their potential. The first 2 bullets on here, I think, are really intertwined, and so are best are probably treated as one, which they lead into the number 1 implication on the bottom. Because Arctic operations are conducted by relatively small forces that even then are operating at the edge of operational feasibility, and I think Jake had actually hit some of the reasons why that is the case. This produces a lot less margin for error when you're planning out campaigns and offensive operations that require a series of things to go well in order for you to achieve some sort of positive aim, as opposed to simply frustrating your adversary. And so as we, and I'm a historian by training, and so as we looked at past campaigns, you just see so many of operations in the Arctic or subarctic coming apart because of the outcome of what in any other theater would simply be a skirmish actually has a major impact on the relative correlation of forces. Or one convoy, whether it maritime or land, is lost, and then because of the being up at the edge of logistical feasibility, the whole campaign comes to a halt. Or there's destruction of a key infrastructure node, a port, an airfield, a bridge. And so all of this really favors the defense within the Arctic because so many things have to go together and there's such a small margin of success, margin of failure within your operations. The other factor, and we kind of hit upon this, and this is new to the 21st century, is that as we talk about multi-domain operations, high latitude. And so there was some discussion about the problems with space coverage and whether that's for communications or whether that's for intelligence gathering. When we have all of the strange electromagnetic spectrum aspects of operating at high latitudes really challenges the way that we'd want to operate, requires some fairly large investments in order to fill those gaps. And then depending upon what kind of solution we're coming up with, it might be regional. And so we can imagine that if the U.S. Army were to say we really want to build our capability to operate in the European Arctic, what are the things that we would do? And with the fairly good road networks and larger towns, as Dr. Greaves had mentioned today, I would go in, I would put in some pre-positioned stocks. Maybe I build out my intelligence or my communications infrastructure. I do some specific training. I optimize my units for that area. I could be very ready to operate at the operational, the campaign level within that, based off of those investments, and those may not necessarily transfer over into the North American Arctic, where a lot of those investments would no longer be of use. So where does this all lead us to in terms of the Arctic dilemma? And so I think that our senior leaders, and I'm glad that I'm but a mere colonel and don't have to make the hard choices, because there's a very difficult dilemma for folks like our Secretary of the Army or our Chief of Staff of the Army. So for some of the reasons that I briefly hit, and I'd be happy to go into more depth, but I wanted to make sure I got to this slide. Investment ahead of time is absolutely critical within the first year or two of operations if forces are going to be effective in the Arctic. No doubt about it. And we see with Russia's struggles in Ukraine today, the operational endurance of most modern militaries is fairly low. So 1 or 2 years might be all you get. So investment ahead of time is an absolute precondition for success. Because of the nature of the Arctic, that might be very localized. And so when they make that investment in forces, it may only be for one of those 3 regions. And so it's a fairly niche investment. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of change laying around in the defense cushions of the couch. And so, and then Dr. Friedman hit this a little bit in her comments. And so when you have that much pressure on force structure, that much pressure on budgets, can we buy forces that are niche and are really only going to be good for a fairly small set of missions? But towards the other side, is it politically feasible for the leaders of countries, the Arctic countries like the United States, like Canada, to say that we do not have the capability to operate on our own sovereign territory? I can imagine no politician that would want to make that admission. And so we have a very difficult dilemma ahead of us in terms of where we want to spend finite resources and force structure. But if we're serious, and going back to the first comment or the first presentation today, those are the sorts of hard decisions that we need to make. Thank you very much for your time.
Dr. Corriveau, yes?
I feel like I'm back by popular demand. But
Exactly. We were waiting.
indeed, now for something completely different, because in this session we're talking about modernizing defenses up in the Arctic. And so I'm going to give you the perspective of a laboratory director. And so this will be a little bit different, but I think it comes in perfect after your talk, Colonel Clark. I think these are going to fit well together. What I want to do is 3 things. I want to go back in time a little bit and talk strategically about the Arctic. And then I want to take a moment just to show you the laboratory confederation I'm part of, so you have a sense of what a laboratory is like. This might be new to some of the folks in the audience. Then I want to talk about going forward when it comes to the defense of the Arctic. I want to point out that the origins of my laboratory, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, located in Hanover, New Hampshire, goes back to World War II, when about 10,000 soldiers were sent up north to build the Alaska-Canadian highway. And they discovered something called permafrost, and it was a mess. And so I have some pictures here from back in the 1940s. It was quite a feat, but there was a tremendous sense of urgency, World War. They had to have this logistics route going up into Alaska, and so they did it. And to this day, we're a residual of that effort, because of the realization that it's important that an Arctic nation understand its terrain to include permafrost. And indeed, I'll get back to this in a minute, but during the Cold War, we actually put in place a permafrost research tunnel. If we go to the next slide, which I'm controlling, by the way. Now we're getting up to the Cold War. And again, there's a sense of urgency again because of the tensions between the former Soviet Union and the NATO countries. And so even the Corps of Engineers that I'm part of was playing a role in the far north to include, for example, the early warning systems, air basin, putting in infrastructure. I thought worthy of pointing out that at Camp Century up in Greenland, the organization I work for actually pulled out a ice core almost a mile long, and then we went and pulled up more down in Antarctica. And what's interesting, I'm going to connect that to climate change, because here we are, Corps of Engineers up in Greenland, pulling out these ice cores, bringing them back down to Hanover, New Hampshire, and then they get put to use. Because you can go back through time with the ice cores and you can look at what the temperature was eons ago and the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And it was through some of these seminal studies it was discovered that as the greenhouse gas level in the atmosphere went up, so did the temperature of the planet. And then, of course, when the levels went back down, the temperature went back down. So it's kind of interesting that even back during the Cold War, we were doing research which would contribute significantly to the understanding of climate on our planet. So now we come to today. And so World War II was a long time ago. The Cold War was over years ago. And so we entered this new phase of a reality from a laboratory perspective. Currently, Krell, there I am, a little star up there in New Hampshire. We're part of a confederation of 7 laboratories that work for the Army Corps of Engineers. And so we're basically called on to meet the needs of the nation and, quite frankly, the planet in many ways. And so, to tell you the truth, there wasn't a lot of call for our laboratory to be in the cold regions of the planet. The Cold War was over, and quite frankly, we were part of the peace dividend. Believe it or not too many years ago, perhaps most of the work we were doing was counter IED. So we were kind of following the needs of our nation. And yet we're still here. We still have a presence in Alaska. In Fairbanks, we have a research lab. I mentioned the permafrost tunnel research facility up in Fox, Alaska. And if any of you study anything to do with permafrost and you haven't been there, that's like Mecca. You got to go. Talk to me. I'll hook you up. Okay? It's just it's life transforming when you go down into that tunnel, deep down into the permafrost. Today in Hanover, we still have a facility with unique infrastructure to do research in the cold. We even do research, for example, for NASA, because it's cold in space. And we have retained core competencies. And so here's just a small illustration of some of the areas where we're actively doing research. There's that expression, domain awareness again. We're doing a lot of that. We're doing a lot of work on infrastructure, not only in the Arctic, but Antarctica to support the National Science Foundation. And we care about our planet, so we do a lot of research which involves bioremediation in cold regions, or as you can see in the bottom right, we're even looking at mitigation technologies in case there's ever some type of oil spill in ice-covered waters. So here we are. What we do as a laboratory is we respond to the needs of our nation and our allies. And right now we're watching all of these policy documents coming out. It's like, wow. So we have a national strategy for the Arctic, a DoD strategy for the Arctic. We have an Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard strategy for the Arctic. People are talking. Now, and that's nested within climate change, because coming out of the White House, we have the executive order from President Biden to do something about tackling climate change. Then we have Department of Defense. Was that some form of Freudian slip? Department of Defense strategy, followed by an Army strategy for the climate. And so as we're going forward, we're seeing these strategic drivers, which are indicators to us. We're going to be called upon to provide research and development activities to support these emerging priorities in the Arctic and for climate change. Worthy of note, again, I work for the Corps of Engineers, and they recently published their top 10 research and development priorities. One is climate change, and the second one is to protect and defend the Arctic. So we're watching these strategic drivers, and we're trying to, as a laboratory, and this is a little tactical now, we're trying to keep folks informed because people are about to make some important decisions about defense of the Arctic. Policies are in place. Right now, decisions have to be made, quite frankly, where do we put the money? And so we're trying to keep people informed about how to do that. So, for example, we have a full-time liaison out at NORTHCOM NORAD, so that we're engaged with the combatant commander. We have hosted events to try to help our Department of Defense identify key scientific and technical gaps in the Arctic. So, for example, we had a workshop in May. We co-hosted it with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and we captured through Army, Navy, Air Force, and some of our allied partners, such as Canada, some of these strategic gaps that have to be filled. That was followed up just recently with the second workshop, which focused on infrastructure. And again, Army, Navy, Air Force was there, the operators, our Canadian partners, talking about what are the gaps that have to be filled as we go into the future. And sort of an indicator to me that something's happening is the phone is starting to ring off the hook. Folks keep coming to us asking us questions about what's going on in the Arctic, to include all the other Army labs across the United States. So we sense this sort of surge in response to all of these strategic drivers dealing with the Arctic and with climate change. And so this is my last slide. This is just an example of some of the emerging themes I'm seeing when it comes to what should be done in the Arctic. One is people are actually asking the question, how cold is cold? If you look at various requirements documents or various manuals about operations in the Arctic, they all have different temperatures. And so we're trying to work with folks on trying to determine down to which temperature should we be able to operate. So if anyone from Canada has an answer, just come and see me after this talk. Come to Winnipeg. Yes, come, there you go. You've heard a lot about domain awareness. This is a huge theme, especially when it comes to threat detection. I'm also seeing a tremendous call for improvements in modernization of infrastructure. For example, to make sure that if you're on permafrost, that your infrastructure is stable and resilient. But also, what about expeditionary infrastructure? This is infrastructure that you put in place on a temporary basis. There's a demand call for that kind of capability. Power and energy. A lot of talk about power and energy, and people, again, are talking about are we actually going to have mobile nuclear reactors? I mean, that discussion's taken place. Maybe the answer is yes. I think the jury's still out whether or not that's really going to happen. And when it comes to infrastructure and power and energy, I'd kind of tie that all together. And by the way, that gets us back to not only Arctic, but to climate change. And finally, human performance. Whenever I'm anywhere near a medic, frostbite comes up. This is an age-old problem, and it's still a problem. And there's a lot of good ideas out there for ways we can help to mitigate frostbite or to treat it if and when it happens. So here's some of the themes I'm seeing for the future when it comes to requirements. The jury's still out as to where those big investments are going to be made. And I thank you for your time. It was a pleasure having a few minutes to talk to you and see you around the conference.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to the question and answer period. Are there any questions in the room? In that case, I'm going to ask, actually, I thought the concept of the Arctic dilemma that Colonel Clark suggested is quite interesting, and I would like to hear a little bit more about how you think it can be overcome, and maybe from the other panelists too.
Yes. Keep holding down on it? Or? Okay, there we go. Yeah, so to make it a little bit more stark, and so the fact that you have this binary aspect to Arctic capability that you don't necessarily have with other environments, in connection with the fact that what our estimates are that there is a huge step change in resource requirements to go from having a bare minimum defensive capability to actually being able to support offensive operations, and the fact that we have, only so much excess capacity right now, to me, and once again, this is just my opinion, seems to kind of go towards the fact that maybe the minimum investment right now in being able to defend sovereign territory can be met and has to be met for political imperatives. But I don't think that it's a dilemma that we can necessarily get out of in terms of if we have the desire for large-scale power projection. And actually on Joe's, he did a better job than I did in terms of advertising the Army strategy. He had all the different lines of effort on one of his slides, and essentially it was built to provide the Secretary and the Chief with investment options. It was not a single unitary strategy, but a bundle of some options for investment. And I think that some of those, when we start talking about Arctic MDO, and so very sophisticated long-range strike and reconnaissance sorts of aspects, and then also being able to project forces at the campaign level, might be a little bit more than the market can bear at this point.
Anybody else? No. Any other questions? Yes, there's a question in the back.
Thank you, Thomas Hughes, once again, taking up some airtime for us. Thank you ever so much for the presentation. I've got a question for Captain French, really, and it's around the concept of the information domain, because it seems to me that perhaps there's two different definitions of the information domain that have been talked about today. One, I think, is around integrating information and understanding the environment, but I understood from what you're talking about, it's a little bit more about how people think about the situation. It's a bit more cognitive. So what does investment in information operations capability look like in the context of the Canadian Armed Forces? And what role, again, should non-military agencies be playing in assisting with that mission?
Right. So thanks for the question, Thomas, and I'll try to do my best to hopefully reply to the exact question that you're after. From the Canadian Forces context, I think what I was referring to in the information domain is definitely that messaging, the STRATCOM messaging, and being able to recognize perhaps adversaries' actions in that information domain that's disruptive to our own information, our own narrative, our own strategic comms. So what we work through, I think, in the Canadian Forces is how does that work without being targeting, the Canadian public, without saying we're influencing the Canadian public. And so we're trying to work through that. What's public affairs? What's public relations? And what's information operations that we work through. I think it's important that and the northern stakeholders certainly recognize, whether it be RCMP, Canadian Coast Guard, and Transport Canada, a host of other government departments recognize that is a domain that they play a part in as well, and not just strictly Canadian Forces. So we are working with them to figure that out. I think the most important thing for me in Joint Task Force North and looking at that is we really work with Northcom and CJOC and a bunch of other allies in HQs across to really, as Dr. Charron pointed out, to really capitalize on those opportunities when we have simultaneous combined and joint exercises going on or in sequence, and to really make sure that that information operation is showing the unity of effort, the exact deterrence effect that we are, and the fact that they're calculating the cost of an action in that area because we're putting that information out there. So that is in and of itself good deterrence. So that's kind of what I was referring to. I'm not exactly the expert on how the Canadian Forces is going to invest so much or modernize that, but specifically from the Arctic context, I can say we're working with allies to make sure we maximize it.
Any other question? Yeah.
Not sure what MDO, multi-domain operations, means in this total Arctic scenario, but it seems like we're still infantry focused or mech focused, and if we're truly talking about an MDO look, then where does cyberspace come into play? Those sensors, we don't need a whole, division of infantry on the ground to make that happen. So where do we start to talk about those things and have those actually be in place?
Yes, ma'am. No, thank you. That's a great question. And in some ways, this kind of dovetails with the last comment. One observation that we made in the strategy in terms of specifically like the information operations is once again, the Arctic is unique in that if it's human density, population density is a major aspect of information operations, and there's fewer facts on the ground within the Arctic. Now, whether that is a advantage or a disadvantage would be contextual, but I think that actually opens up some really interesting maneuver space that you might not necessarily have when you have such dense populations and everybody has a cell phone and 5G. You can actually have a little bit more control over the space. But then this kind of, dovetails, ma'am, into your comment that could we do, and in the press, there have been all sorts of things about, a multi-domain task force. I'll put the U.S. Air Force on the line in that we were part of a panel for the Wilson Center. And Iris Ferguson, who's now the DASD across, DOD, by the time was working for the Air Force, when they asked her what was the #1 risk in terms of implementing the Air Force's strategy, she said that it was actually building out the IT structure. And so I think that in some ways, the Arctic probably does favor the 20th century solution because could we do multi-domain operations up north? Yes. But that means that we probably have to have some very bespoke investments in the space in order to get the coverage, both for the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as for the C2, as well as we have to come up with some solutions for some of the high latitude, operating around the poles, what that does to EMS, and so. I'm not sure that anybody's actually going to be able to solve those problems. We could. I have no doubt that the engineers could come up with solutions. But the Air Force, which is a little bit further ahead in their thinking on this, they were taking a look at that bill, and it was causing them to rethink a little bit. So. It might be that the old Mark I, infantryman might be the best thing up there in terms of military power, even though that's not necessarily the flavor of the day.
Other question? Oh, do you want to add something?
Yeah. Well, I actually have a question for Dr. Corriveau.
Please go ahead.
So the focus is always on studying cold weather, but how much a study is done of changing climate, and especially what about when it becomes really, really warm in the Arctic? Because that increasingly is an issue. We're seeing more bugs. We're seeing change in wildlife. Is there a focus on that?
Yeah, the tech guys are.
It's all working. You can just go.
Yes. We see increasing investments in trying to understand the change in environment, especially in the Arctic, because that part of the planet is changing the fastest. And so when we talk about cold weather, we're not only talking about the Arctic, but other cold regions of the planet. one would even envision winter warfare, like in Eastern Europe, and something we might be seeing in the upcoming months in the Ukraine. We are an example of where we specifically, my lab is looking at one issue. It's the change of the microbiology of permafrost when it thaws out. For one thing, you get more greenhouse gas emitting life within the permafrost, which leads to more greenhouse gas emissions. We're also looking at, as well as other government agencies, other countries are concerned about what if the permafrost thaws out and some type of pathogenic microbe is released. And the reason they're thinking about this is because within the past decade, there was a caribou in Siberia that thawed out, and people in a village were exposed. I think it was a 12-year-old boy who died from anthrax. So this has, raised a specter of interest about the change in environment being brought about by climate change, which results in more pathogenic entities being in the environment. So we are monitoring that. We're trying to study that. But there's a lot of work to do. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Good question. Thanks.
Gunhild?
Well, thank you for yet another great panel. Despite being the last one of the day, it's very easy to stay awake. Not least because I'm apologizing, but or your last slide, Professor Corriveau, on where you showed a publication, which I really need to get my hands on, Regaining Arctic Dominance. I'm just thinking, do we use titles like that still? I mean, and in part because I'm thinking of actually a lot of the discussions this whole day, and I'm kind of preempting what I'm going to say tomorrow, but are demonstrating the importance of a civil military cooperation to take place to actually defend the North. This is not just a military operation. It is a lot is happening in the civilian domain, and in particular when we're talking about under threshold, and actually it's in the civilian domain where a lot of the responses have to be coming. So and thinking about, particularly from what I'm learning in the Canadian and American Arctic, that the people in those Arctics, I don't know whether regaining Arctic dominance is necessarily the way to sort of like characterize that relationship, but and it is about the civilian domain. And one thing I want to ask about is there's hints about the vulnerabilities and how vulnerabilities are being used in under threshold threats. Also kind of preempting what I'm going to say tomorrow, but I'm curious how you're looking at these vulnerabilities, because actually they're, the under threshold threats are having to do with existing vulnerabilities in our societies, which are targeted to make use of actually the garbage that we deal with, our attitudes towards each other, particularly based on inequalities and such, and trying to polarize our societies. So I'm just wondering if I could get some sort of have a little bit of thought process here on some of those existing vulnerabilities you see that are relevant in the Arctic today that could be targeted or made use of in these particular contexts. And it's not only foreign adversaries that are doing it. It's also internal. Thanks.
I thought I'd invite the Colonel to start. The title of the Army strategy, yeah.
Well, two completely unsatisfactory answers first, and then I'll throw something out there. So first, I will say that a senior leader thought that was a smashing title, and I agreed and told him how good looking he was and what a great title it was. Because actually a lot of people have said, did you ever really have Arctic dominance? And that's a fair enough statement. So it might just be silly, even in the very narrow sense that it was meant. Which then actually leads into my second point and to my earlier comment. We were talking, our remit not only was did we want to stay within it? But we were told very specifically to say, talk only about how you're going to make Army tactical forces, because we would have been slapped down if we had tried to get out into the policy realm, because that was other departments. That's the bureaucrats, cop out. But I'll throw it out there. But to your broader point, so the Army Arctic strategy was never going to get into that, because that was just what we're going to do. I think that you have hit on something very important in terms of what really we need to be specific in our thinking, because it's much more nuanced in terms of, and I'm even sure that threat is the right word, because that then kind of leads you down a certain mental path. And then what are the solutions? And I think that today's conversations have highlighted a lot of the tensions and a lot of the difficult decisions, and different values and different interests that are in tension. And I don't think that there's a single necessary answer, but I don't see that the military instrument is necessarily the most important in this area.
So just to add on, I think that's a fantastic question in terms of how we're looking at it, not just from the military standpoint, but the civilian and the vulnerabilities that we are protecting. And I probably agree with you that dominance is a hard thing to describe how well you're doing at. It's like, do I have command of the sea, or do I have sea control, or do I have sea command, or what do I got? It could be a little bit relative, and I think probably achieving information dominance, jury would be out if you've totally dominated the entire information environment. But I think some vulnerabilities we're looking at, which could be exploited, is any division between the allies and partners in the North, on the policies or on the framework or in the governance framework, that could be exploited by an adversary, and a gap in the way we're looking at whether it be Northwest Passage policy or the use of the Northern Sea Route or anything like that could be exploited. That type of divide. If you think about if you think about the fact that Canadian forces might not be able to put forces somewhere for very long. We would look and be able to enforce a Canadian, perhaps support another government department in support of Canadian law enforcement, or putting RCMP in the right spot at the right time to do that. We'd be looking at, do we have vulnerability in carrying out a whole of government operation in the North to enforce our own sovereignty? And as you mentioned, even some vulnerabilities in terms of our own narratives with our own communities. Is there divides between governments, or between territorial governments, Indigenous governments, that we have to be conscious of, that in the information domain could be a wedge to be used in terms of that. So I think that's why we are focusing in on not just kinetic and not just the type of military presence response, but also closing up those vulnerabilities, or not letting wedges form in those gaps, so that we're better prepared.
I'll offer 2 points, I think, and this is where academics might be helpful. Whenever I read about civil-military relations, it's always with respect to military relations over there. Rarely do we talk about civil-military relations in a domestic context, except for when there's a problem between senior commanders and the president, so to speak. But that's a totally different issue. So we're not very good about thinking about that need and that relationship between our militaries and civilians. And increasingly, this is going to become a really big issue. The other tyranny we have is the 2-year rotation. And this is not unique to the military, but also many of the federal government experts. They're there in the position for 2 years. They just start to figure out what's going on and who's who. And Madeline and I were talking about this. And then they leave. And you got to strike up the band again. And you usually don't start where the other person left off. You got to go back in time. And that's extremely frustrating and is a waste of time and effort on all of our parts. I would say the model for that is the Canadian Coast Guard, which has made a concerted effort to send back personnel to the same communities in the summers when they're operating in the Arctic. And I think they are going to see dividends from that persistent, continued relationship.
Thank you. We have another question from Will Grieve.
Good afternoon. Will Greaves, University of Victoria. Thank you so much for your comments. I'd like to pick up, if I could, on the exchange between Brigadier General Burkhead and Colonel Clark, because you kind of concluded and seemed to agree that infantry might be an underappreciated resource in the North and a capability. And in the Canadian context, it seems to me we don't hear very much about infantry in the North, a little bit about the Air Force, but really it's about naval assets. It's about the Royal Canadian Navy and it's about the Coast Guard. And so my question is for Captain French and perhaps Professor Charron, but I'm wondering what your assessment would be in this context of vulnerabilities, whether Canada's defense procurement process could be understood as a potential vulnerability because of the lag in replacing vessels. And I guess related to that, Admiral Topshee recently gave, I thought, very interesting comments on the possibility of political interference in the procurement process to replace the frigates in the Navy and potentially downgrading the number from 15 to 12. And so, and he really seemed to be warning, so to speak, that would be so unadvisable. So I'm just curious, would you kind of agree with that assessment, that there's a potential vulnerability just in the way that we go about defense procurement? And similarly, is the Canadian focus on Coast Guard and Royal Canadian Navy sufficient for the Canadian kind of defense interests in the North? Thank you.
Good. So is it too late to say that I speak for myself and my own opinion? You're asking me to ask, in this room, defense procurement is a vulnerability. So yeah, defense, I mean, first of all, to your point on the infantry, I do think we cannot necessarily be so, take a look at single services and really just say that is going to be, the silver bullet or the answer for all Arctics. I think the more we work through Arctic problems, the more we realize that there is a room for what we deploy in the Army, when we deploy the Army up there, to be supported by AOPV, to be supported by frigates, to be supported by the Air Force. And so the way we work the joint problem space is really, I think, the best way of dealing with the potential threats that we're seeing and working through making sure we're flexing the joint muscle. And I know that there's Army exercises in the North, there's Navy exercises in the North, and a bunch, and the Air Force working in it. It might seem the maritime air is going to be the important domains, but I wouldn't want to underestimate the importance of having a strong Army that's capable of operating up there for long, as Colonel Clark has pointed out. To the issue of procurement and being that vulnerability, I think certainly we asked for Nanisivik Naval Facility to be open, it was announced back in 2007. So it's 2022. It's not necessarily operational yet. So that part of the infrastructure is a really important piece to us. We're working through that. So that leg, I think, yeah, definitely is a vulnerability. Our ability to get AOPV, although Treasury Board, probably one of the fastest ones from the Conservative government through Treasury Board to get approved and get going, still sees delays, but maybe not procurement related, but maybe just getting the shipyards up and running to the point where we got AOPV. But despite a long start on those, I think we have now a pretty good out the gate with the first few AOPV deployments in the North. And certainly we're seeing the next ones come out the pipeline in the fashion. So how that plays out, I don't know. I think the interesting thing, though, I think is to really think about the all domains, is that the AOPV is not going to necessarily be able to, even if we have 6 out there at any given time, is not going to be able to surveil the whole North the whole time for the whole year, and to really get the effect that we're really after. So we got to really look at the mission sets of the AOPVs in the Harry DeWolf class, combined with the new surface combatant, combined with new capabilities coming down the pipeline for all the services and not just the Navy, and determine if it's going to play out for this mission, this type of threat, then it's not just going to necessarily be one platform that's going to deliver it all. So I think it's important that we work on the joint capabilities that are going to be out there. We imagine ways in which the surface combatant is also going to have roles further north than perhaps that were just in the away game and away in expeditionary. And I think too that we have to look at we also have to invest in not just the platforms, but also the infrastructure and the support hubs that are going to go along with it to actually to meet the demand. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. Yeah.
So, and I in true academic form, I'm going to answer the question I want to answer. And I see another vulnerability, defense procurement, absolutely. But I'm increasingly concerned at how reliant we are on volunteers generally for crisis management and search and rescue in Canada generally, but especially in the Arctic. Often you'll find that community members are the fire agent and the ranger and the search and rescue, and they're also on the Coast Guard Auxiliary, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we have, the industry has a different perception of what's available and what's in the realm of possible. And whereas in 2016, when the Crystal Serenity, the first sort of large cruise ship went through, there was a full-on court press with that company, with the Government of Canada, hopefully with some input from local communities about what they needed to do to contribute to any search and rescue scenarios. So we're not just depending on local communities, but I fear with this return to quote unquote normal with COVID and a rush for everybody to go see things quickly, that again, it's going to fall on the local communities. They're going to be quickly overwhelmed, and you know, is that fair?
Any other question? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Mark McQuinney, Carleton University. I'd be remiss not to ask a question now because Dr. Greaves has brought up procurement. We were getting dangerously close to my area of research. One thing I wanted to ask our American colleagues, climate change is characterized by uncertainty at this point in time, especially as adaptation and mitigation efforts unfold sort of in real time. So how do we modulate dealing with that uncertainty, given that sort of as we're somewhat uncertain of the particular magnitude and direction of climate change effects, whether that be with how engineers are focusing their research efforts or whether how the Army is planning in their wargaming. So is it the case that there's a plan for a worst or a best case scenario as far as emissions are concerned, or is there like a range of scenarios that are considered at established graduated emissions projections?
I'll defer to you first, Joe, though I can, yeah.
Thank you, Colonel. Another great question. I agree there's some uncertainty about where we're going to end up, but it's the scientific evidence is overwhelming that our planet is rapidly changing. And so in the U.S., what I'm seeing is a full frontal assault on trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And I see it everywhere I look. My laboratory consortium is starting to receive substantial money to go after greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation is another important aspect to going after the problem, but right now I see the U.S. focused primarily on greenhouse gas emissions. For example, I talked a lot about installations. I can't remember the number of Army buildings, but the federal government the U.S. federal government came to realize that it's like a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's coming from installations or buildings. So there's a big push to try to do something about that. When you hear about greenhouse gas mitigation, lots of times you hear about electric vehicles, and we're all starting to realize the immense challenge of everyone owning an electric vehicle. It's going to be a journey to get there. So I see the U.S. government moving out. I also see that part of the policy of the government is to work with other nations and to work with the private sector to make it a reality, because it's a colossal challenge to actually turn around the amount of greenhouse gases that are going into our atmosphere every year. And if you want to follow the scientific evidence, I could get really depressing. You know, it's probably a good word to use. It's kind of bleak what we're looking at. So it's real, and if we don't act right away, it's going to get bleaker. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to what the Colonel might have to add.
Well, and in terms of the, we were doing some future forecasting before I left the office, and approaching this as a historian, as I said earlier, and also my boss happened to have a PhD in history as well before he retired, so we saw things very similarly. We had assumed that there would be a 10 to 15% tax on the Army budget in terms of things like mitigation, transitioning over into, new technologies and, going to, for both the tactical and non-tactical fleet. Those sorts of things we weren't that necessarily that concerned about. With a background in history of science and technology, it's not necessarily the first order, it's the second and third order changes. And so, as bad as it's going to be, those are engineering problems that we are going to be difficult and make life miserable for some people. But what are going to be the underlying cultural, social, political, economic changes that come out of that level of dislocation? That's where it really gets kind of scary, and that's where the cone of uncertainty opens up in a way that, French Revolution was in part caused by a climate crisis that was leading to higher bread. What does that mean in the future? I don't know, but luckily I'm off of the X in terms of the strategy division, so I leave it to my successor.
Well, please join me in thanking all our panelists for this great conversation.
Thank you, all of us, our panelists today. So again, we have some gifts for you, and just I'll have a few notes here in one second after I pass these off. So, did you get one already? Did you already get one? Okay.
Double dip.
I'll take 2 bags of coffee. All right, so we're going to do our end of day wrap up. Just a few quick administrative notes. For those of you who are joining us for the dinner cruise tonight, the conference dinner will be held on the Island Star boat. Boarding will start at 1800 sharp on the Crawford dock on the back side of the hotel. There's a path on the west side of the hotel that goes out to the dock, and the boat is enclosed, but it still can be a bit chilly, so please bring a jacket and dress appropriately for the weather. For everyone attending tomorrow, our panels on diplomacy and international cooperation and the joint security cooperation. I just have a quick reminder that we'll be starting tomorrow morning at 08:25 here in this room. And please don't forget to share about your experience here with us at CASIS on social media. So make sure you tag us, hashtags, and we really appreciate all the feedback we've been getting so far.